The sixth commandment, you shall not murder. The key thing which Prager highlights in his analysis is that the operative word is murder and not killing. And the distinction which this raises is that a person can defend themselves whilst a person who has a premeditated desire or working towards taking someone's life, and that could be motivated by the desire to take a possession or a spouse or something from them, those are all obviously violations of the commandment, and those are all subject to the judicial code according in that nation. Now, in the Marxist inversion, we have the alternate perspective of reality and form of logic through which things are assessed, alongside all of the differentiated concepts with which the world is understood. These all influence our perceptions, the things to which we attend to, and the moral value of different objects, different people, and the decisions that are made. So now we come to the Marxist inversion, which is that history demands the total extirpation of all counter-revolutionaries by those with Promethean consciousness. The socialist construction must take place. And what I'm alluding to here is that history has a goal. It's got a telos in Hegel's system, and when materialized, it therefore also has a telos within Marx's system. That telos is communism. Communism is not just the abolition of property, it's moving from one epoch, one system, you could say, in time into another epoch, a new system in time. So communism is a distinct historicist epoch from the epoch in which we would say that we are currently existing. So it's a way of differentiating basically the form of society, material relations, all of the knowledge and culture and religious aspects of life which are dominant. Obviously in communism it's supposed to be the resolution of the issues of class antagonism, the fight, and then obviously the socialist aspect, which is in consciousness, and the construction which is being built in consciousness first, aimed at, and then being manifested as a material reality. And there's a drag towards this. There's a necessity which is tied into the moral project. So hence every action, every thought, and so on and so forth are tied towards realizing this goal. Now, the important thing is the conceptual framework which Marx establishes through the dialectical system of logic, which is antithetical to the present and existing understanding of reality and the moral framework and the moral value that we attribute to objects and people around us. So you'll recall that physical work and action in the world is categorized under the various forms of labor, the division of labor, and from the Marxist reinterpretation of the present world, division of labor, as in different jobs, different trades, they're remunerated differently, and this facilitates the differentiated rate at which people can accrue private property. So part of that is wages, and then some of that can be obviously fed back into the capitalist system. Well, all of it's fed back into the capitalist system by the purchase of products. The prices of these are determined by Marx to already be rigged. So anything which is more than the value of the raw materials essentially to make the product itself, and some value attributed to the labour, which he doesn't necessarily specify in his early works, is just simply has an extra part added on top of it by the capitalist in order to steal from the person, because the labourer cannot recoup that aspect which has been added on. They're not in control, they're not in possession of the property, whereas the industrialist, the capitalist, can. So from the get-go, the entire system of labour is permeated by theft, and likewise it's a form of slavery. There's no ability for the person to get out of it unless it's through revolution. So if we recall, the division of labour, the different professions, leads to different remuneration, which is theft, and then obviously the differentiated accrual of private property. Now, the thing which helps to prop this up is the concept of fetishism, which is often a bit more poorly understood in the Marxist literature and even by Marxist theoreticians. From what I can discern of what the concept means in my reading, fetishism is tied really to the system of logic and the semantic way in which we understand the world and how we categorize it around us, influencing the moral importance of everything that is taking place in the world, particularly of material action. Now, fetishism is essentially one of the is tied to the form of logic. So when you see objects as differentiated from one another, this is part of the fetishistic issue that Marx is getting at. So seeing an object like a bottle of wine separate from yourself then allows people to relate to it materially, that in a certain way, which is in turn reflected up into their consciousness. And the thing which is meant to be occluded is how there is a degree of oneness between all of them. Now, what this would mean is that I, for example, relating to this bottle of wine, put some sort of spiritual power through it in order to get you to see it the same way. And in you seeing it the same way, you see it as an object which is distinct from yourself, but which you desire to possess for yourself. And it's this possessing for the self which is the movement of somebody's desires through the material fetish onto another person, inducing them to thereby take part in the existing system in the sense that they desire to possess the bottle of wine for themselves, and hence they have to have a job, they partake in the system, the division of labour, and so on and so forth. So you can see that there is this neat little cluster of concepts and relationships which are established with the dialectical logic and the concepts that Marx establishes. And this is used in conjunction with moral valuation at all points. And then likewise, it's also being governed by the dialectical purpose, the end point, the historicism. So all of those moral valuations attached to the individual concepts of labour, private property, fetishism, so on and so forth, they're all made incredibly negative. Negative to the point of they are evil and must be overthrown. Now, it's also important to remember that Hegel was writing his document in response to the events in the French Revolution. He was, on the one hand, seeking to restore religion through philosophy. So this is God is the issue of man rather than man being the issue of God. So that inversion is very important because it allows mankind to just arbitrarily define the contents of God, or ultimately, if you're looking at it from the Commandment's perspective, in the second commandment, it would allow it's humans creating idols. So Hegel's absolute would be an idol. Marx's socialist or species being would be a form of idol. The important thing, however, like I was saying with Hegel, he was responding to the French Revolution, and the key figures to understand there are Robespierre and Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. Saint-Just because he was a very young man who forsook his education in order to become a revolutionary. He aspired very high, but he was nicknamed the Archangel of Terror for his role in the persecution and deaths of tens of thousands of people during the French Revolution. It was his public denunciation in a speech against the Bourbon kings which then led to the regicide, the guillotining of the French king. So he is essentially one of the prophets of Marxism, if you want to look at it, or if you want to describe it in that sense. So the issue being is that you've got the false form of reality in which all of the persecution and human sacrifice is taking place through the system of labour, through the use of fetishism by the people who have and who induce people into the system of private property and labour, even though technically it's not really the fault of those people, it's historical circumstances that have led to the whole nest of horrible moral evils taking place. And then ultimately it's all to be overturned. It's this overturning process which is facilitated by the generation and realization in people's consciousness of the class antagonisms, and then the class antagonism needs to be resolved by the classes ultimately destroying one another. This is all really kind of inspired by Saint-Just in a sense, because as you can see during the French Revolution, it's the peasant class or the people who live in the towns and things who rise up and destroy the lords and the monarchy. So that's the model which is driving it. Now, the important thing is that once you've applied the system of logic to, you've got the dialectical evolution to be imposed on humans, as in it is the guide through which human development is to be forced, then you start to force people to fit very certain molds. And the issue that I'm trying to stitch together at this point is that once you have this requirement for violence and destruction in combination with directing people towards a certain goal, for which people need to be reformed to have a certain consciousness, to be oriented towards a certain goal, such as the realization of socialism and the species being the monadological pantheist aspect of material nature, that once you've got all these ducks in a row, the only way that you can actually get to the pantheist species being is through the destruction between the classes. Now, of course, if you're accepting the way that I'm describing and interpreting Marx's system, then ultimately it's that in order to constitute the pantheist materialist God, people must die. It's a system of human sacrifice. So that's my interpretation of ultimately that's the inversion of the sixth commandment in the Marxist literature. And I'm going to try and back this up with one or two statements. So Marx says that there is only one means by which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new society can be shortened, simplified and concentrated, and that is by revolutionary terror. So revolutionary terror, Antoine de Saint-Just, he was the archangel of terror. So you can see where they've grasped their methodology from. It's from the way that the French revolutionaries were behaving and conducting themselves against the existing classes. And the interesting thing is it's blood it's a murderous death agony of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new society. And the two are in a dialectical relationship with one another. But in order to shorten the strife between the death of the old and the birth of the new, which itself is a dialectical movement, it's this aspect of the old being dragged through and preserved in a sense, but consumed by the new creation, so the bloody birth throes. But the bloody birth throes actually refer to the terror and the murder. And I've read much Marxist literature, and there's very few things that, to be honest, at this point, shock me or surprise me, but coming across this quote by Engels recently was one that certainly raised my eyebrows, and he says that the chief mission of all the other races and peoples, large and small, is to perish in the revolutionary Holocaust. It's one of those statements that's so abrupt and direct that I decided to get an extra translation from it, which obviously confirms the original. So we see the other saying, all the other large and small nationalities and peoples are destined to perish before long in the revolutionary world storm. For that reason, they are now counter-revolutionary. So recall that if you don't accept their interpretation, their semantic system, their moral judgments on all of the world, then you instantly become a counter-revolutionary. To be a counter-revolutionary is basically to be marked for destruction. It's kind of like almost the you're just marked for killing. That's why Marxists quite enjoy lists. You create lists of the counter-revolutionaries, and then once you obtain power, you start to just basically liquidate them. Engels then goes on to say that striving with all his might to conjure up the Austrian, Germans and Magyars will be set free and wreak a bloody revenge on the Slav barbarians. The general war which will then break out will smash this Slav Sonderbund and wipe out all the petty hidebound nations down to their very names. The next world war will result in a disappearance from the face of the earth not only of the reactionary classes and dynasties, but also of entire reactionary peoples, and that too is a step forward. Now there's a couple of things in here. Firstly is the aspect of the Austrian Germans and the Magyars, in the modern day Hungarians, and they are locked in this death battle with the Slav barbarians. So you've got here an example of essentially the proletarian or the subaltern contingent, and then you've got the contingent which they are fighting against, so the bourgeois, or in this case the Slav barbarians. Now the thing that's very interesting about the article in which Engels was writing here was that the Austrian Germans and the Magyars, from Engels' perspective, had essentially anointed themselves to be the revolutionary class who are going to act as the spearhead in the world revolution. But this presents quite an interesting point, which is that the international revolution can begin within a people, within a people in a sense that within a nationality or an ethnicity. So baked into this model of developing the revolution, you've actually got a form of national socialism which can be established. And this is years prior to Hitler ever coming up with his system, and indeed years prior to Giovanni Gentili developing the neo-Hegelian system of Italian fascism. So the interesting thing is that Italian fascism and Marxism can be compared to one another, and an analysis of Gentili's system reveals very interesting insights into Marxism, which I did in my book. Now, the second point here as well is to smash the Slav Sonderbund. So you've already got here Engels in the 19th century talking about how the revolutionaries need to destroy Russia. And of course, in the 20th century, we know precisely what happened in Russia under Lenin and the Soviets. They succeeded and they did annihilate many, many people. Now, the final aspect really is the clear declaration of a genocidal intent, and the purpose is that as soon as people don't obviously conform to the Marxist system and interpretation, they're counter-revolutionaries, and then they need to be exterminated. Their entire history needs to be exterminated and then pasted over with communism and socialism. So again, we can see that Engels directly rejects and inverts the commandment of Christ, and Marx obviously does as well. Now next we see that Lenin states that the Catholic Centre Party are counter-revolutionary. Given what we know, this therefore means that a political party are counter-revolutionary, so they need to be destroyed, but importantly the party here is underpinned by the Catholic framework of understanding the world, belief in God, 10 Commandments, and the following Christ. So where that value system is adopted, those people explicitly need to be annihilated. Those people explicitly need to be annihilated in order for communism to be possible of becoming, and in order for socialism to then be capable of being built. So in order to get to communism, in order to get to socialism and the construction of socialism through the communist period, you need to go through the murder of the Catholics, you need to go through the murder of the Slavs, you need to go through the murder of all of the counter-revolutionaries. So in order to get to the construction, the end point, you need to annihilate all your enemies. So this is from a different perspective. You could just say it's a conflict, you're destroying your enemies, but when you have the antithetical aspect, which is governing the philosophy of praxis, dialectical materialism, you then have the anti-God, which is worshipped, ultimately the Luciferian aspect of man, which is being used to destroy Catholicism, but then ultimately which moves into the humanity union with nature. That's why he is nature. That's the new form of divinity. Man is the supreme being of man. What more do you want? So you can see how the entire framework works, and ultimately how human sacrifice is the route to the constitution of the man-made God. So Lenin prided himself on developing a social system based on bloodletting. Again, a bit more evidence as to the shedding of blood, which is the thing which is referred to in the commandments as the sin. That's the thing that's explicitly being gone after by the leftists. And it's education which is the key battleground, because that's fundamentally the thing which leads to the form of logic, the concepts, the morals, the historicism, and then everything that ensues. Now, lastly, on that point, Mao states that deaths have benefits, fertilizer is created. Now, deaths having benefits, of course, if the ends justify the means and you're willing to kill your enemies and things like this, or the people that you dislike and disagree with, or in this case, the people that you feel are preventing the creation of God, then, of course, you're going to take that view. But the idea that fertilizer is created to me stood out quite considerably, and the reason being that the function of fertilizer is to refructify the ground. You are trying to use something man-made to place nutrients back into the earth in order that something else may grow in the future. And it's quite important in Marxist theory because from their perspective, labour was such a sacrifice of humanity and nature that it would lead to not only the death of people and the exploitation of people, the sacrifice of people, their slavery, and ongoing torture, but it would also lead to a sacrifice of the world. So Marx, in a letter, directly stated that the capitalist production process would lead to desertification. So allowing private property to continue would basically turn the earth barren. It's all like we'd strip it like locusts. And the idea of fertilizer is almost, perhaps even more than almost, is if you're conscious of the fact that you need to annihilate capitalists in order to get to this new promised future, then ultimately it is using the nutrients from the dead who have been culled in the past society to put them back into the field in order for something then to grow and for the field to be fructified again. So you can see how it's a dialectical reversal of the desertification process by using the blood of those who would have made deserts to then go to the soil and to put their nutrients back into it. That's quite important, I think, because once you realize that Mao states things such as the Chinese people are the supreme being, so that again that will be a national socialist realization of the international socialist project. It's just a case of moving and making it completely totalizing. You've got the consciousness that they're a divine, that they're a form of divinity, and that they are united with nature, and then destroying the enemy and returning them to nature is creating fertilizer for them as an entity. This is one of the reasons why I state that there is a form of kind of inverted Eucharist, which is also latent within the Marxist system. We would expect that if there is the antithesis of the Catholic, because you would be seeking to generate the complete opposite of each one of the seven sacraments. So instead of marriage, you have complete dispersion and individual sex love, like Engels states. Instead of love your neighbor, it's kill. It's instead of we've gone through it in the earlier video. Okay, so yeah, when it comes to Mao, deaths have benefits, fertilizer is created. This begins to have a different meaning when we understand more of Mao's mind, and we have explored that through the earlier commandments. And the aspect here is that it's got a very dialectical nature to it, which is that the dead return to the ground and they are in some sense preserved now in the body of the new form of divinity in the pantheon. And these are the works cited, and I hope you've enjoyed the video.